All right, so this week we're going to talk a little bit about welding symbols. There is a ton of different welding symbols that you could use. We're going to kind of talk about the basics, probably the most predominant ones that we really kind of use on drawings and stuff. So when we get drawings to actually put things together, a lot of the times it's hard to kind of do three-dimensional designs, kind of like you could see on the right-hand side. So instead of doing that, we do two-dimensional drawings, and then we add these welding symbols that are going to indicate different things. It could indicate dimensions, the depth, how far deep the root needs to go, all sorts of different information, the type of weld that you're going to complete, where it's going to be welded, and all that kind of stuff. So there's a ton of different things. If you look at books, you look at things, but some of the basics is really kind of what we're going to be focused on when we're talking about welding symbols. So probably the first thing that we need to kind of think about is there's really kind of three components to it. You have the reference line, the arrowhead, and the tail. So the reference line is going to be that horizontal line that's going to be drawn across. And every time on any one of these drawings, you're going to see a horizontal line. The arrow is also going to be a very important and vital part to the weld. So like where the weld is going to be at. And the tail is typically going to be used, if you see the tail, typically going to use to kind of tell you that, just any other information. It could be a multitude of different things. It could be the type of, welding rod that you're going to use, to just any other information that might be on there. On this reference, you see WPS. WPS stands for Welding Procedure Specifications. So it's kind of like what settings would need to be in there, what you need if it's like MIG welding, what they want the wire speed to be run at, what they want the voltage to be run at. It's going to have all of those things. Arrows and things like that, they're not always going to be on the left-hand side. Sometimes they're or not on the right-hand side. Sometimes they're going to be on the left. Sometimes they're going to be underneath. It really kind of depends on where it kind of fits within a drawing to not like clutter things up as much as possible. So those three components there, you got the arrow, you got the reference line, which is horizontal, and then the tail, which is going to be the two lines coming together, kind of almost creating a little arrow just for some additional information. Some of the symbols that we see, and really we're kind of more worried about, really a couple of these things when we're dealing with it. If we're doing groove welds, so these are going to be things like the butt joints that we've done in class. If we're just doing a square groove weld, so we're just putting two pieces of metal together and we're going to be welding that joint up. What that joint looks like is going to be dependent on the symbols that we see. So everything we've done in class, it would just be a square joint. So we're not like taking and grinding it down. We're not beveling things into it. If you were doing that, then we could see like we would use a V. That's going to be a bevel on both pieces of metal. A bevel right here would be a single bevel. You can see kind of the mirror image if it's going to be on the top of the reference line or below the reference line, what it's going to look like. Are we doing a J? Are we doing a U? Are we doing a flare? All those different things basically has to deal with how those things mesh up with the other pieces of metal that we're welding. So these are going to be for the groove joints. Really the biggest one that we need to think about is just the square one, because that's kind of what we've used in class. You may see a V, which is a double bevel, or you may just see a single bevel line. How it's drawn, whether it's on the top or the bottom, is kind of referenced here. And that's going to be important in the next slide, where we talk about the arrow side versus the other side. So on a drawing, when you have a welding symbol, wherever the arrow touches, it's going to tell you where that needs to be welded. The opposite side of where it touches, okay, is the other side of that weld. The arrow side is always shown below the reference line. So you're never going to have an arrow that's going to be pointing up. So if we want to make a weld on underneath or the bottom side, okay, you're simply just going to have it on top. That arrow is always going to be pointing down. So we know the arrow side and then the other side. So in this example right here, you see where we have the arrow touching. Okay, that's the arrow side. And then opposite of that, if we wanted to weld on the other side, we would have that. I don't know if I have it here. Hold on, let me go through. Okay, So I don't know that it explicitly says that in here, but when you have the reference line, anything that is going to be underneath that reference line is going to be done on the arrow side. Any reference or any markings that's made above the reference line is going to be done on the other side. So the example that we see in this picture here kind of demonstrates that, where you have this symbol, and this symbol is for a fillet weld. This is not a single bevel, because a single bevel, if we go back underneath, would be opposite. So that would be touching the line, and it would be an open triangle, where on this one it's a closed triangle. So that's going to indicate a fillet weld. Because it's below the reference line, it's going to be done on whatever side the arrow is touching. So if this symbol was on the opposite side and it was underneath, the weld would be completed on this side. But because the arrow is touching this side and the fillet weld is indicated below the reference line, that means that the weld is going to be completed there. You could do another little triangle on the top here, and that's going to indicate that we're going to weld on both sides. So where the drawings are at on top or below the reference line is going to indicate where those things are going to be done. So this example is a really basic example of a welding symbol here, where you're going to have a butt joint, and underneath there, underneath on the reference line, we have a double bevel. So that means we are going to be creating a bevel on both pieces, and those bevels need to add up to a 60 degree. Now, even though it's underneath the reference line here, on the actual drawing, the top of that weld is where we're going to bevel. That's where we're going to make that joint. And then together those things are going to be a 60 degree angle. So it's kind of a little bit opposite in this situation, where it looks like it might be done underneath here, but because the arrow is touching the top and the markings are underneath the reference line, you're going to want to do it actually on the top. On the next example that we could see just to the right of that, we have a bevel on the bottom and a bevel on the top. It's going to be a 60 degree angle. And even though it doesn't say it on the top, a lot of times we'll kind of mirror that, so we're not having to put a ton of information. So we put the angle here, and then we're going to say we want an 1/8 of an inch gap in between those. So we're going to bevel both the top and the bottom, and between them, we're going to have an 1/8 inch gap. And that's what we can see right here on this reference line. Because we're doing both the top and the bottom, we're going to be beveling that. If we needed it to be a different angle, we would indicate that in here. But if not, you just assume that whatever's done on one is going to be done on the other side, especially in a butt joint like this example here. There's some finishing symbols, like how we want the weld to look when it's actually done. And some examples of that stuff you can kind of see right here. We'll kind of start to the right-hand side where we look at the contour. So it's what that weld wants to look like on the top. Does it need to be flat? Does it need to be convexed, or does it need to be concaved? Depending on what we're calling out, you may or may not see these symbols. You may not care if you're like, hey, it doesn't matter, just weld it up. Or if you're like, no, the finish needs to be flat because we're going to put something else on top of it. Or we want it convexed because we want a little bit more thickness to that to help increase its strength. So these are kind of an optional thing. You may or may not see them when it's all said and done. Do we have spacing? Do we have backing? Do we, have consumables? We're not too worried about these. You don't necessarily see them very often. You could see a melt-through symbol. That's going to be just a solid arc there, saying that we want to get 100% penetration on that weld, on that joint. Probably the other two are the ones that we see kind of on the left, where we got this weld all around and a field weld. What a weld all around would mean, and that's always going to be on the little bent thing where the arrow meets their reference line, and it's going to be a circle. If you see that, that would be indicating on like any kind of pipe or tubing where it's not really in a certain position. We're just going to say we're going to make this weld all around. So if it's a pipe that's going on a plate, you would do a weld all around symbol. You're going to indicate, obviously, it's going to be a fillet weld, but we don't want to weld just half of it. Especially on pipe where it's round, you don't really have one side versus the other. It's either do we weld it all around or not. So square tubing, you can kind of use that as well, because in a two-dimensional drawing, it's hard to get a three-dimensional aspect to it. And so the weld all around symbol is something that we'll see, especially on tubing, pipe, things like that. The field weld is going to be indicated by a flag. And what that's going to be determining is if a weld, let's say we're building a project in a shop. And I always use the example of like a staircase, right? We might build the staircase in a shop, but then we've got to actually take it out into the place that's going to be positioned as an actual staircase. That might require welding that can't be done in the shop because you need to attach it to an existing structure. You can think of this too as like a railing, on a concrete, or on a sidewalk. If we're trying to tie it into something that's already existing, and we're not bolting it down, but we're actually welding it to an existing structure, that field weld is indicated that that weld or that joint can't be welded in the shop. We have to take it out on location and then weld it on location. So it's a pretty important one, especially when we're constructing things that are going to be put into other places. That weld symbol becomes really important. So this says the S position of the welding symbol indicates the depth of the bevel, how much needs to be in there. It may indicate the size of it, the strength of the welds, the strength of each leg in a fillet weld. The groove weld size, it could be the depth, how well it penetrates into the base metal, the E position and the welding symbol, what position you might be welding those things in. So when we do talk about like the depth of the bevel and the groove size of the weld, you can kind of see like on this example in this butt joint here, we've got two bevels here. You can see a picture of the weld, how far down that bevel goes, which is 3/8. The weld itself should penetrate 5/8. If we're welding on both sides, you're going to help get a complete penetration with that. The welding symbol would be indicated as shown here, where we have the arrow side pointing on the bottom. Both of these things are going to repeat, so you're going to have parentheses that are going to tell you the depth. The bevel is going to be outside of there, and then you've got the double bevel groove on there. This one doesn't indicate like what angle they need to be at. They don't always need to do that, and if it doesn't indicate it, then it's just up to the person that's actually completing it what they're going to bevel that stuff to. Sometimes when we're welding on big projects, we don't weld the full length of that weld, and so we do what we call intermittent welding. So we weld like short sections, and then we have a space where there's no weld, and then we have another weld, and then there's a space where there's no weld, and so on and so forth. Things where we don't require full strength, we're not trying to seal it, we're not trying to hold any kind of liquid. That's going to save a lot of time with welding. It's also going to, have less distortion with the heat input. And so on bigger projects, different things like that, we're not welding the entire length of it. Probably a good example would be if we're doing like a trailer barbecue and we're trying to weld in the sheet metal for the pan there. We may not weld that all the way across because we don't care if it's sealed. We're going to put firewood in there. We're going to, heat it up. It's not a big deal. In fact, sometimes you actually want water to leak out of that. And so you don't want it to retain that water in there. So intermittent welding is often used on those. The length of the dimensions should be indicated of each weld. The pitch should be indicated, and the distance from center of weld to the center of the next weld. And the next picture is going to show you a good example. Oh, it's going to come up into here. Sometimes we might require them on both sides, okay? And so there's different ways that we can do that. Sometimes we might stagger them if we're welding on both sides. So we're not welding in the same exact spot, but we can kind of weld all the way across. So we can do offset welds. We can do all that kind of stuff with it. So in this picture right here, you got a three-dimensional drawing of the joint. And this is going to be a T-joint. That's going to be all the way across. But we're not going to weld a weld that goes all the way across that. If this thing is, 8 inches long or even longer, what we want to do is we want to weld a little bit underneath. We want to weld a little bit on top. Weld a little bit underneath, weld a little bit up on top. And we can do that with this welding symbol where we have the arrow side, okay? And what we have is the two fillet joints that are staggered off of each other. And that indicates that you're going to separate those things out. We're going to want a 2-inch weld. That's what that 2 is going to indicate. And then it's going to be a 4-inch on center. So 4 inches from center of one weld to the center of the other weld. That's going to give us a 2-inch gap in between because there's an inch of weld here, an inch of weld there. And so 2 inches minus 4 is going to give you that 2-inch gap that we have in there. So rather than using a very, very complicated drawing like this for a very simple part, you can actually do something that looks like this, use that weld symbol, and this is going to indicate what that's going to look like. And that's one of the big advantages of using welding symbols, is that you can simplify the drawings, simplify that stuff, and as long as you know how to read them, you can accomplish something that looks like this without actually giving you all that detail. So it shortens those things up, especially when we're talking about doing big projects, large projects, to have every little weld position, what things need to be in there, what they're going to look like, how we're going to actually put them together. This can be complicated when it's like a big building that we're actually working on putting together just for this one little part, this one little piece that we have there. Backing and melt through symbols. Okay, so sometimes if we require that stuff, we're going to add those things into there. So an example of this is what the weld is going to look like. We want this to melt all the way through. We want one side to be beveled, the other one's just going to be flat metal, but we want to make sure that we get 100% penetration. And so that's what we're going to use, that solid semicircle there. That's going to indicate we want that joint to be welded all the way through. We're going to have a single bevel. It's underneath the arrow side. So what that's indicating to us is that or underneath the reference line. So that means that bevel needs to happen on the arrow side, because anything underneath the reference line should be done on the arrow side. An example of the weld all around or field weld. So if we have a pipe that's coming in onto a plate or onto another pipe, we can have the weld all around symbol, meaning we're going to weld it around. And this part indicates that this weld needs to be done in the field. So once we take the part out to that stuff, it's going to be done outside of the shop, in the field, or in another shop, or a house, or wherever we're putting those things, in a school. It's going to indicate that stuff there. You can also use welding symbols to indicate multiple welds. So if you've gotten to the triple pass on shielded metal arc welding, you know that we make 3 welds onto one side, and that's things to help build up, especially on like thicker metal. We might make more than one pass, and so doing multiple passes, we can actually indicate this with weld symbols by having multiple reference lines from one arrow side. And when we do these things, the one that's furthest away from the arrow is going to indicate the last operation. So you're going to work from the bottom side and then work our way up. So on this bottom side, we can see that we have a fillet weld that we need to make. It is on the top of the reference line. So that means that first weld is going to be done on this side right here. So this weld is going to be our first weld. The second weld, it is a bevel. We need to bevel that stuff out. Okay, so one side's going to be flat, one side's going to be beveled. It's a single bevel. And then we're going to weld. That is underneath the reference line, indicating that weld is going to be done here. So that first weld is going to be this weld in this position right here. The third weld is also underneath. It's telling us it's a fillet weld. We're going to fill in that groove on that first one, so there's no need to bevel it. And we have this little arc here that's indicating that we want that weld to be a little bit convex. So we actually want it to be a little bit rounded off at the end of those things. So we can use that to tell us what order and how many we need to do, which this picture may not be able to kind of tell us that information. The weld symbol is going to allow us a little bit more information. Again, the two drawings are fairly similar. They're not like, one's not like more complicated necessarily. This one just tells a different story and gives us a little bit more information on the order on how we actually want to weld these things together. If we're talking about plug and slot welds, these are not things that we do in this class, but you can do welds where we punch a hole in it, we drill a hole, maybe we have a slot, and then you actually are going to fill that area up with a weld. So instead of doing like a lap joint, maybe we can't do that. Maybe we want a square end, but we want to join these together. That's where plug and groove or slot welds really kind of come into play. We can use these things, these welding symbols, to tell us, where it needs to be. Does it need to be flat? Where are the positions of these things? Maybe we're actually having to process and cut these things out. So we might get an indication with a weld symbol, and it's going to tell us these information about how big these are going to be, how many of them are going to be on there. and the spacing that those things have within those. And so it can tell us all that information. With the slot welds, kind of the same thing. We can see where those are at. We can see that plug weld, we want to be only 5/8 of an inch deep. We don't want to fill it all the way to the top, versus the little plug weld where you want that thing to be smooth onto the top there. So it can kind of indicate a little bit of different information. There's a lot of different stuff. Sometimes there's a little bit of communication because not everything has to be in these welding symbols here. Spot welds is a method of joining two or more pieces together with a weld. That's not in the edge part. Typically, when we talk about thinner metal, a spot weld is just a weld symbol is just a small little kind of tiny circle. So almost like a period, where you would just have that. That's going to indicate that we're just going to do a spot weld, or like a tack. We're not actually going to be welding that thing full up. But really, when we deal with small sheet metal, that's where we see that stuff. So you can see we've got a little small circle right here that's going to be in, between both of those pieces. You're going to be welding both of those pieces together. You could indicate the size, the strength, the spacing, number of welds, how many need to be in there, what welding process could be done in the tail end there, indicating other information or other stuff that might be relevant to what we're looking for there. So that's kind of the basics of welding symbols. There's a lot more to it, but it's a little bit more complicated to kind of get too far in depth. So these are just some of the basic information to kind of get you guys started in understanding the basics of weld symbols.